Hello, we are so excited to show you our native speech capabilities. Welcome back to the English journey. Today, we are discussing the single most important factor in your success, your mindset. My name is Anna, and I am here to guide you through how to reprogram your brain to learn English faster than ever before.
And I am Abel. I'm so glad to be here with you, Anna. Most people think they fail at English because they don't have enough time or talent. But the truth is often hidden in how they talk to themselves. Today, we want to talk about how a simple shift in perspective can turn your struggles into your greatest strengths.
That is such a perfect way to begin, Abel. And I want to start by asking you something personal, something that I think every single listener today will immediately recognize in themselves. When you were younger, or even recently, did you ever sit in a language class and think to yourself, I am just not a language person?
Oh, Anna, honestly, yes, many times. I remember sitting in my English class when I was about 15 years old. The teacher asked everyone to read a paragraph out loud, and when it was my turn, I mispronounced a word. A few people in the class smiled, and I remember feeling my face get very hot. After that, I told myself something that stayed with me for years. I told myself that some people are simply born with the ability to learn languages, and I was not one of those people. I genuinely believed that for a very long time.
And that belief, Abel, that specific thought, is one of the most powerful and most damaging things a language learner can carry with them. What you experienced is something that the researcher Carol Dweck, a psychologist from Stanford University, spent decades studying. She called it the fixed mindset. A fixed mindset is the belief that your abilities, your intelligence, your talent, are things you are simply born with. They are fixed. They cannot change. If you are good at something, it is because you were lucky enough to be born that way. And if you are not good at something, well, that is simply who you are, and no amount of effort will truly change it.
That is exactly what I believed. And what is so interesting now, looking back, is that because I believed I could not improve, I stopped trying. Why would you put in effort if you think the effort will not work? It becomes a kind of trap you build for yourself without even realizing it.
You have described it perfectly. The fixed mindset creates what psychologists call a self-fulfilling prophecy. You believe you cannot do something, so you do not try. Because you do not try, you do not improve. And because you do not improve, you feel confirmed in your original belief that you were never capable. The cycle repeats, and it gets stronger each time. Now, Carol Dweck contrasted the fixed mindset with something she called the growth mindset, and this is where everything begins to change. The growth mindset is the belief that your abilities are not fixed points. They are starting points. You might begin at a low level, yes. You might struggle, yes. But with the right kind of effort, with the right strategies, and crucially, with the right attitude toward your own mistakes, you can grow. You can improve. Your brain can change.
And that word, change, is so important because I think many learners, especially adult learners, feel like they've missed their window. Like the brain of a child can change and grow, but by the time you're an adult, your brain is somehow locked and learning a new language is simply much harder or even impossible.
This is one of the most common and most persistent myths in language learning, and I'm so glad you raised it, Abel, because the science tells us something genuinely exciting. The science tells us that the brain, at any age, retains the remarkable ability to change its physical structure in response to new experiences. This ability has a name, and it is a word I want every listener to learn today: neuroplasticity. Let us slow down and really understand what this word means. Neuro refers to neurons, which are the nerve cells in your brain. Plasticity comes from the Greek word meaning to mold or to shape. So neuroplasticity literally means the brain's ability to mold itself, to reshape itself based on what you do, what you think, and what you practice.
So when I study English every day, something is actually physically happening inside my brain?
Something remarkable is happening. Every single time you learn a new English word, every time you practice a new grammar structure, every time you listen to English and try to understand it, your brain is forming new connections between neurons. These connections are called synapses. Think of it like a path through a forest. The first time you walk through a dense forest, it is very difficult. There is no clear path. You have to push branches away. You have to step over roots. But the second time you walk that same route, it's slightly easier. The third time, easier still. Over many weeks and months of walking that same path, a clear, wide, easy trail appears where before there was only thick forest. That is exactly what happens in your brain when you learn and practice something consistently. The neural pathway becomes stronger, faster, and more automatic.
I love that image. It makes the whole process feel real. But what about the age question? I've heard people say that after the age of about 12 or 13, the brain loses its ability to learn languages easily. Is that true?
There's a kernel of truth in it, but it has been greatly exaggerated, and for many language learners, this exaggeration has become a harmful excuse. What is true is that children learn certain aspects of language, particularly accent and pronunciation, with a kind of ease and naturalness that is genuinely harder to replicate as an adult. This is related to what researchers call the critical period hypothesis. But here's what that theory does not say. It does not say that adult learners cannot learn languages. In fact, in many respects, adult learners have significant advantages over children. Adults have larger vocabularies in their first language to draw connections from. Adults have more developed logic and reasoning, which helps with understanding grammar rules. Adults can deliberately choose to study and can manage their own learning in ways that children simply cannot.
I had never thought about it that way. I always assumed being an adult learner was purely a disadvantage.
Many people feel that way, and it is understandable. But research from neuroscience keeps showing us that adult brains, given the right conditions, continue to grow new neurons and to form new connections throughout an entire lifetime. A landmark study in the late 1990s by researchers in New York showed that the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain most responsible for learning and memory, continues to generate new neurons, even in elderly adults. This was actually a surprising finding at the time, because for many years, scientists believed that the number of neurons you were born with was the number you kept for life. The discovery that new neurons are born throughout life, a process called neurogenesis, changed everything. It confirmed that learning is not a privilege of the young, it is a capacity available to every human being at every stage of life.
Okay, so the science says our brains can change, but knowing that intellectually does not automatically change the way you feel in the moment. Like, I know the science, but when I am in a conversation and I forget a word or I use the wrong tense, I still feel that familiar wave of embarrassment and frustration. What do you do with those feelings?
This is where we move into one of my favorite practical tools, Abel, and it is so simple that people often dismiss it before they have given it a real chance. It is a single word, one word that, when added to certain sentences, has been shown in psychological research to change the emotional and motivational impact of that sentence on the brain. The word is yet.
Just the word yet?
Just the word yet. Let me show you how it works. Think about the difference between these two sentences. The first sentence is, I cannot speak English fluently. The second sentence is, I cannot speak English fluently yet. Read those two sentences slowly in your mind. The first sentence is a closed door. It is a final judgment. It says that this is simply the truth about you, and it carries no hope, no direction, and no future. But the second sentence, simply by adding that one small word at the end, opens a window. It says that fluency is not your current reality, but it is a destination that is possible, that is ahead of you, that you have not arrived at yet, but that the road exists.
It is such a small change, but I can feel the difference even as you describe it. The first sentence feels heavy. The second one feels like it has some air in it.
And that feeling you are describing is not just psychological or metaphorical. Carol Dweck and her research team at Stanford actually conducted studies looking at what happens in the brain when students receive a grade that says not yet, as opposed to a grade that says failing. When students saw not yet, the areas of the brain associated with future-oriented thinking and problem-solving became more active. When students saw a failing grade with no context, the areas associated with anxiety, avoidance, and threat detection became more active. In other words, the word yet literally changes which parts of your brain get activated. It moves your brain from a threat response, which closes down creative thinking, into an approach response, which opens up learning. This is why building the yet habit into your daily language learning practice is genuinely one of the most effective and least expensive tools available to any learner.
I want to try to make this practical for people listening right now. So how would you suggest someone actually build this habit? Because I know from my own experience that changing the way you talk to yourself is not as easy as just deciding to do it.
You are absolutely right that it requires conscious efforts, especially in the beginning. The first step is awareness. You cannot change a habit that you do not notice. So for the first week, your only job is to begin listening to your own inner dialogue, particularly around English. When you sit down to study and you struggle with something, what is the first thing you say to yourself? Most people, when they become aware of their inner voice for the first time, are genuinely shocked by how harsh and negative it is. They would never speak to a friend that way. They would never tell a friend who was learning something new, "You are so bad at this. You will never improve. You are wasting your time." But they say these exact things to themselves, often multiple times a day, without even realizing it.
That's painfully relatable. I used to say things to myself when studying that I would be embarrassed to say out loud to anyone else.
And those words matter, Abel. They matter enormously because of something called the subconscious filter. The subconscious mind is the part of your mental processing that operates below the level of your conscious awareness. It's handling enormous amounts of information at every moment, most of which you are not consciously aware of. And one of the things your subconscious mind does, continuously, is listen to the dominant narrative that you tell yourself about who you are. If the dominant narrative is, "I am bad at English," then your subconscious mind will, quite literally, filter your experience of English learning in a way that confirms that narrative. It will cause you to notice and remember your mistakes more than your successes. It will cause you to feel more anxious in English-speaking situations, which will actually impair your memory and recall in the moment. It will cause you to unconsciously avoid situations where you might have to use English, which of course means you practice less, which means you improve more slowly, which feels like more evidence that you were right all along.
So the story we tell ourselves actually shapes what we're able to hear and remember. The internal dialogue is not just noise in the background, it's actively affecting our ability to learn.
Precisely. The reticular activating system, which is a network of neurons in the brainstem, acts as a kind of attention filter for the brain. It decides, based largely on what your subconscious has been programmed to look for, what information reaches your conscious awareness. If you have told yourself that English is impossible and that you are not good at it, your reticular activating system is primed to look for evidence of this. And because the world is full of information at all times, it will find the evidence it is looking for. But the beautiful thing is that this system works in both directions. When you begin to shift your internal narrative, when you begin to tell yourself a different story, the reticular activating system begins to filter for evidence of that new story instead. You start to notice the moments when you do understand something. You start to feel proud when you use a new word correctly. You start to see your mistakes not as proof of failure, but as data about where to focus your effort.
Speaking of mistakes, I want to stay on this topic for a moment because I think the relationship that most learners have with their own mistakes is one of the biggest invisible barriers to progress. Can you talk about how to genuinely change the way you see a mistake? Not just telling yourself it is okay, but actually rewiring the emotional response.
Yes, and this is what psychologists call reframing. Reframing is the practice of consciously choosing a different interpretation of an event, one that serves your goals better than the automatic interpretation does. Now, reframing is not the same as denial. It is not about pretending a mistake did not happen or that it does not matter. It is about looking at the same event through a different lens and finding the genuine value in it. Let me give you a concrete example. Suppose you are speaking English with a native speaker and you use the wrong preposition. You say on Monday when you should have said by Monday. The native speaker gently corrects you. The automatic, fixed mindset response is embarrassment, the feeling that you should have known better, the thought that a truly capable person would not have made that mistake. And often, following that embarrassment comes avoidance. You do not want to be in that situation again, so you speak less. You take fewer risks with your English.
Yes, that cycle is so familiar. The embarrassment leads directly to becoming more quiet, more withdrawn, and that quietness feels safe, but it actually makes everything worse.
It makes everything worse precisely because language learning is, at its core, an active and social process. The more you speak, the more you expose yourself to correction, the more you grow. Silence is the enemy of fluency. So the reframing looks like this. You make the same mistake with the preposition, you hear the correction, and instead of the thought, I should have known better, you consciously practice the thought, this mistake just showed me exactly where I need to focus. This is useful information. Without making this mistake in a real conversation, I might not have noticed this gap in my knowledge for months. This mistake just accelerated my learning. And I want to be clear that this is not just a motivational slogan. There is neuroscience behind it. When you make a mistake and then receive corrective feedback in a low-anxiety environment, the brain encodes the correct information more strongly than if you had simply read the correct information in a textbook without ever making the error. The emotional activation that comes from a mistake, when it is managed well, actually strengthens memory consolidation.
That is fascinating. So the mistake itself, if you respond to it correctly, becomes one of your best learning tools.
It is arguably the best learning tool available, and this is why the most effective language learners are not the ones who make the fewest mistakes. They are the ones who make the most mistakes in the safest possible environments, and who have developed the emotional resilience to treat each one as a gift rather than a punishment. Resilience, by the way, is another word worth pausing on. Resilience comes from the Latin word meaning to bounce back. In psychology, resilience refers to the ability to recover quickly from difficulties. And resilience is not a personality trait that some people are born with and others are not. It is a skill. It is built through practice, just like a muscle. Every time you make a mistake and consciously choose the growth-minded interpretation, every time you add yet to a negative sentence, every time you keep practicing after a moment of embarrassment, you are building your resilience muscle, and over time, that muscle gets stronger.
I want to bring in something that you mentioned earlier in a slightly different way, Anna. The idea of progress over time, because I think one of the reasons people give up is that they expect rapid, dramatic results. They want to be fluent in 3 months or 6 months, and when that doesn't happen, they conclude that they're failing. How do you address this expectation?
This is so important, and it brings us to a principle that I find genuinely life-changing when people truly internalize it. I call it the 1% rule, though the idea has appeared in various forms across psychology, coaching, and performance science. The fundamental idea is this. Instead of trying to be excellent immediately, instead of trying to go from beginner to fluent in a single dramatic leap, you commit to being just 1% better today than you were yesterday. 1% better, that is all. And here is why this matters so profoundly. If you can be 1% better every single day for 1 year, and mathematicians have verified this, you will be approximately 37 times better at the end of that year than you were at the beginning. 37 times better, not 1% better, not 10% better, 37 times because of the power of compounding.
37 times better. That number genuinely surprises me every time I hear it. Can you explain the compounding part for listeners who might not be familiar with that concept?
Of course. Compounding is a concept most people know from finance. If you invest $100 and it grows by 1% each day, You do not simply have 100 and 365% at the end of the year. You have much more, because each day's growth is added to the total, and then the next day's growth is calculated on that larger total. The growth builds on itself. Language learning works the same way. When you learn 10 new words today, those 10 new words do not just add to your vocabulary, they also make it slightly easier to understand the next 10 words you encounter, because language is interconnected. New knowledge hooks on to existing knowledge and makes the existing knowledge more accessible. A grammar structure you learned last week suddenly makes a pattern you noticed this week easier to understand. The pieces begin to connect with each other, and the rate of progress, while it may seem slow in the beginning, begins to accelerate in ways that can feel almost miraculous to the learner.
I experienced something like that. There was a period in my English learning where I felt completely stuck for months, and then suddenly something seemed to click. Conversations felt easier, reading felt more natural. I didn't know why it happened, but what you're describing sounds like an explanation.
What you experienced is sometimes called the fluency tipping point. It happens when enough individual pieces of language knowledge have been built up and connected to each other that the brain begins to process the language more automatically, with less conscious effort. Before the tipping point, every sentence requires deliberate, effortful construction. You are consciously searching for words, consciously checking grammar, consciously monitoring your pronunciation. After the tipping point, chunks of language begin to flow more automatically, which frees up your conscious attention for higher-level tasks, like what to say, not just how to say it. And the key insight here is that you cannot reach the tipping point without all the slow, sometimes frustrating work that comes before it. Every learner who feels stuck during those months before the tipping point is actually building the foundation that makes the breakthrough possible. The progress is real, even when it is invisible.
This makes me think about the importance of patience, but a very active kind of patience. Not just waiting, but trusting the process while continuing to do the work.
You have articulated that beautifully, Abel. Active patience. I think that phrase captures something essential. It is not passive waiting. It's continuing to show up every day, continuing to choose the growth-minded interpretation of your experience, continuing to add yet to your limitations, continuing to reframe your mistakes as data, continuing to celebrate the 1% improvements that others might not even notice. This is where positive psychology has so much to offer language learners. Positive psychology is the scientific study of what allows individuals and communities to flourish, and one of its most consistent findings is that people who cultivate what researchers call a strength-based perspective, who actively look for and acknowledge what is working rather than focusing only on what is not, show measurably greater rates of improvement in complex skill development. This means that taking 10 seconds at the end of your study session to acknowledge one thing you understood better today than yesterday is not just a feel-good exercise. It is a neurologically meaningful act that reinforces the neural pathways associated with progress and primes your brain to look for more evidence of progress tomorrow.
So gratitude and self-acknowledgement are not soft, optional extras. They are part of the actual learning process.
They are foundational to it. The brain learns better in a state of positive emotional engagement. When you feel encouraged, when you feel curious, when you feel that your effort is meaningful and is leading somewhere, the brain releases neurochemicals like dopamine and norepinephrine that actually enhance memory consolidation and attention. When you feel ashamed, threatened, or hopeless, the brain releases cortisol, the stress hormone, and high levels of cortisol actively impair the hippocampus, the part of the brain most responsible for forming new memories. This is the neuroscience beneath the mindset. When you change how you feel about your learning, you literally change the chemical environment in which your brain is trying to form new memories. A changed mindset is not just motivational, it is biological.
Anna, I want to ask you one final question before we bring everything together, because I think it is the question that is in the back of every listener's mind right now. This all sounds wonderful. It all makes sense intellectually, but how do you actually begin? When someone closes this podcast today and goes back to their real life with all its pressures and distractions and old habits, what is the single most concrete first step they can take to begin this journey of changing their mindset?
The first step, and I say this with complete sincerity, is to choose one sentence, just one sentence that you currently say to yourself about your English, and rewrite it with the word yet. If the sentence is, I am not a confident English speaker, rewrite it as, I am not a confident English speaker yet. Write the new sentence on a piece of paper or in your phone. Somewhere you will see it every morning. Read it every day. Say it out loud if you can. This is not wishful thinking. This is the beginning of rewiring your reticular activating system, the beginning of priming your subconscious filter to look for evidence of your growing confidence, rather than evidence of your limitation. That one sentence, practiced daily, is the seed of the growth mindset. Everything else we have talked about today, the neuroplasticity, the reframing of mistakes, the 1% rule, the practice of active patience, all of it grows from that first small but genuinely courageous act of telling yourself a truer, more hopeful story about who you are and what you are capable of becoming.
Everything we have explored today, from the science of the brain to the power of a single word, points to the same profound truth. The most important classroom in your English journey is not found in a book or on a screen, but inside your own mind. And the moment you commit to changing the conversation happening there, everything in your learning life begins to shift in ways that will continue to surprise and inspire you for years to come.
And that shift, that quiet, courageous decision to believe in your own capacity to grow, is not the end of a journey or the conclusion of a lesson. It is the very first step of the most meaningful and rewarding adventure your mind will ever take.